as we were collecting data in Miami, that was a big part of the data collection effort because we were using photos both to kind of get a scene for what the flood event looked like where the data collection was happening, but we also used it as a backup for some of the data. So we were using, I'm honestly sitting here now forgetting what these were called, but we had these little devices for measuring salinity, and it was possible to take a picture of the result so that you could have a backup in case something went awry with the data entry.
Welcome to another episode of the Mapscaping Podcast. My name is Daniel, and this is a podcast for the geospatial community. My guest on the show today is Kurt Menke, and he is an absolute expert in QGIS. Kurt's actually been on the show before. Back in episode 50, he came along to introduce us to the QGIS project and tell us about the history of it and where it might be going in the future. On today's episode, we're going to continue the conversation around QGIS, but we're going to look at some of the apps that live in the ecosystem around the project itself. So in particular, we're going to look at an app called QField and an app called Input. And these two apps will help you if you're doing a field campaign and need to collect data. They will also help you display data, or display and collect data, I should say, in an offline situation. Kurt will also talk us through how we set up a QGIS project to use with these apps and how we might synchronize data that we collect in the field back to our centralized database. So it's a really interesting episode. I hope you enjoy it. Just a few quick messages from me before we get started today. In this episode, Kurt shares a lot of great resources, a lot of great links. And if you go along to mapscaping.com/podcast, you can join one of our email newsletters. There's two different options there. Join whichever one that suits you, and I will personally send you all the resources that are mentioned in the podcast episode today. That's mapscaping.com/podcast. That's it from me. Really hope you enjoy the interview. I'll see you on the other side. Hey Kurt, welcome back to the podcast. Thanks for taking the time to come back on the show again. So the first time you were on the podcast here, we were talking about QGIS. So for the listeners that haven't heard that episode yet, I would strongly advise you to go back and listen to that before you listen to this one. So today we're going to be talking about, again, the QGIS project, but we're going to be talking more about some of the apps that live in the ecosystem around QGIS and mobile data collection and offline GIS. Before we dive into all that, could you just give us a brief introduction to yourself just before we get stuck into the main topic today?
Sure. Hi. It's nice to be here again. I really enjoyed being on the podcast last time, and it's exciting to be asked back. So I run my own GIS consulting business named Bird's Eye View. I'm located in Albuquerque, New Mexico in the United States. And I've been working for myself for many years. So we're in the world of COVID-19 now, which actually hasn't been a big change for me because I work at home already. So that's been not a big transition for me. And I do a little bit of everything. I do some cartography. I do some geospatial modeling. And I used to do a lot of training and teaching, and that's been put on hold except for a series of webinars that I've been going through with one of my recent books, QGIS for Hydrological Modeling. My co-host is my co-author, Dr. Hans van der Kwast, and we've been holding weekly webinars going through that book chapter by chapter. So that's the model going forward, is trying to get some more training online. And my other endeavor that I'm involved with is something called the Q Cooperative, which is kind of an informal umbrella of myself and several QGIS core developers, spatial analysts, and trainers, and we're working together to provide QGIS support services for people who need new features or custom plugins and things like that.
Part of the reason I ask people to give an introduction of themselves is just to establish the fact that they are someone worth listening to, and you've definitely done that, so appreciate that. So as I said before, we're going to be talking about mobile data collection, we're going to be talking about offline GIS solutions. And of course, this has got something to do with QGIS. So as far as I'm aware, there are a couple of apps out there when we talk mobile and QGIS. We've got something called QField and we've got something called Input. Could you briefly describe what those two apps are and what they do?
Sure. Yeah, they're very similar in many respects. They both are based on QGIS, and they both work off of a QGIS project file and honor all the symbology that you've set up and any project settings that you've set up in that QGIS project. And so they both have the same paradigm where you in one way or another, get that project file and the data onto your mobile device with the app, and open that QGIS project file with the app and go out and collect data, and then somehow get it back onto your desktop or wherever you're storing your data at the end. QField is developed by a Swiss company, OpenGIS.ch, and it is, for the time being, only available for Android. The other one, Input, is developed by a company out of the UK called Lutra Consulting, and that is now available for Android and iOS. So those are the two options that we can talk about.
Okay, so that's the app side of it, but of course we need a QGIS application to create this project file to export it over to these apps. Could you just give us a brief overview of what a QGIS project looks like and how we might set it up if we're going to be using it later on to do field data collection?
Sure. So, obviously it goes without saying that when you're going to do some field data collection, you have to do some project planning and think about what it is you actually want to collect. Both of these apps will allow you to collect points, lines, or polygons. So you first have to set those basically empty layers up and populate those with any attributes that you want to collect. So, for example, if you're going to go and collect trees on a farm or something like that, you would go and maybe set up a column for species, and then maybe you also want to have a column for the diameter of the tree, and maybe you want to have the column for the data collector who's doing the collection for that particular tree and the date it was collected. So you might have, at a very minimum, 4 or 5 attribute columns that you're going to add to that point layer. And then QGIS has attribute forms, and there are these widgets that go along with those. So if one of your columns is for the date and time, you can set that up as a date time column, and you can even set up defaults for different columns. So a good default for a time column for field data collection would be just the function now, which would auto-populate that column with the current date and time. So you can set up some really nice intelligence for your data layers and columns within QGIS before you get it onto the device. And some more examples of those, there's another widget called Value Map that would let you create like a pick list of the different species that you wanted to collect data for. There's one called a checkbox, so you could just check something that's true or not true. You can also set up constraints. So maybe there's a specific question that you want to ask only if you're mapping an oak tree. So you could set up a constraint in there for that column so that you'd only see that if the answer to what kind of tree is it was oak in a previous question, and then that question would appear. So you can do quite a bit of customization for what you'd call your data collection form through these QGIS widgets ahead of time.
Okay, so all of that, of course, is trying to sort of restrict yourself or apply the same rules to your data collection as what you've got in another data model, I'm assuming. Firstly, you want to make it easy for the user. You sort of add some logic for them. Like if it's a tree, then it has to be one of these trees. If it's a date time, I think it should be right now because it's now that you're collecting this information. And I guess with a checkbox, something like a checkbox, it's perhaps a true false somewhere in the background in the database. And of course, that makes it really easy to get the data back into the database because you've got a structured model that you're working with. You said a lot of really interesting stuff there. One of them that really stuck out for me was you need to create these empty data fields and then sort of build up this database. Can I also use these apps to collect data for existing data layers?
Yeah, certainly. There's no reason you couldn't use existing data layers. I just think a more common workflow is for people to, starting from scratch, is to start with a brand new layer. But especially for an ongoing data collection effort, you may be using the same layer for months, collecting the same type of data, and just adding to that existing data set. So that is certainly a common workflow as well.
Okay, so let's say we're preparing this a data collection campaign, and parts of it are going to be done offline. We're restricted mobile data access. Are there any special things we need to think about in terms of offline when we're thinking about creating data models and preparing this QGIS project to be exported out to one of these apps?
One of the things QGIS has are these things called map themes. So map themes basically let you kind of filter what layers are going to be represented on your map. People use these in QGIS for creating like an inset or a locator map, for example, where you only maybe want the study area to be on the locator map. And so you set up a map theme that is just your study area polygon. And then the rest of the layers become the main map. And you have two map themes, locator and main map in that example. So you can also do this to create an online and an offline version of the map. Especially people will often want to use a base map, like an OpenStreetMap base map, for example. And in that case, what you can do is generate MB tiles or vector tiles for your layer, and you can set that up as your offline map theme. And then the one that's being pulled directly via the web from OpenStreetMap could be your online map theme. So when you get out into the field, you can choose which map theme you're going to be working with depending on what your current situation is.
Okay, so that tiled layer, that'll sit somewhere on the device itself, and that'll be the background for the data collection.
Yes, absolutely. So typically, you'll set these data up, and it's common these days for people to use the GeoPackage format to for most of their vector layers. You can also in there have a folder for your MB tiles, and you would basically get all of that data and your QGIS project file onto your mobile device so that you have it all there too. And when you open it up on QField or Input, it's going to look exactly as it does in QGIS desktop.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how we get this project file onto one of these apps. Now, do I open the app through a USB connection and then just push it over, or is there some sort of synchronization process that I need to be aware of?
So yeah, this is one place that currently these two apps differ. Like I said, these two, QField and Input, are very similar, and they're both undergoing rapid development. So even specifying a difference is a difference today, and it may not be a difference a month from now. But as we sit here today, if you're using QField, there is a QField sync plugin to QGIS, which basically allows you to set up your QGIS project, use that plugin, and it packages up your project into a geo package, into a folder that you specify. And then you basically hardwire your mobile device to your laptop and drag and drop that folder for your project onto your mobile device. If you're using Input, there is a plugin that comes along with Input called Mergin, MERGIN. And this is both a plugin, but it's also a cloud service that Lutra provides. And so you can go to the Mergin website, which will be in the show notes. I'll make sure you have that. You can sign up for a free account, which comes with 100 megabytes of storage space. You create a login and a password. And when you install the plugin, you log into your Mergin account. And you can then, it shows up in the browser panel of QGIS as a data provider. And you can basically synchronize your project through that Mergin data provider, and it will upload your project to your cloud account. And that Mergin cloud account is the middleman between your mobile device and your desktop environment. And it allows you to synchronize your project back and forth between the two environments.
That sounds really, really, really smart. I really like this idea of something doing the work, making sure that the project is synchronized, that the data is synchronized. So I completely understand when I have made my QGIS project, I'm exporting that data. Let's say it goes through Merge and over to Input, for example. I get that side of the process. Now, does that synchronization, does that still work when it comes the other way? Because what I'm thinking is you're out in the field, you're collecting data, perhaps you're updating existing data. How do I get that back to my centralized database? Is this the job that Mergin does for us?
Yeah, that is exactly what Mergin does. So it works the other way too. It will allow you to open up QGIS, right click on the Mergin provider, and synchronize your project from your cloud account to your desktop. And some of this depends on how you have things set up. So obviously, it's also possible to have all your data in an online PostGIS instance, for example, and in which case the synchronization wouldn't really be necessary. But if you're working in a file, a flat file format or with geo packages, Mergin provides that functionality for you. And, I mentioned that these two apps are very similar. So this is a case where I do know that with QField, OpenGIS is working on a QField cloud service. So this is something that I imagine will be coming to QField in the coming weeks and months. It's just not here at the current time.
So I think this is going to solve a lot of problems for a lot of people. I personally have had that experience where I've had people working in the field and they go away. It's an offline environment. They really want to take their data with them. They want to be able to update it, and it's been an absolute nightmare trying to sort of synchronize that data back into a centralized database and sort of maintain that single source of truth. So this sounds like an incredible solution for this. Can you give us some examples of where you've seen this working in the wild?
Yeah, absolutely. My personal experience comes through a project that I've helped develop for the National Library of Medicine called Community Health Maps. And this is a program that we set up for public health workers, which is getting to be apropos these days with the COVID-19 crisis happening. We go in and we show people how to, who are public health workers. And so that means that they are not typically people with a GIS background or GIS training. And we show them how to use things like QField or Input for field data collection, and then how to use QGIS to work on an analysis of those data or a map afterwards. And one thing I'm impressed with is that these are intuitive enough, both of them, that I can, in a 4-hour workshop, train public health workers who have never used any of this how to set this all up and work with it and go out and collect some data and come back in and map it. And so it is definitely something that is pretty accessible. So one of the interesting projects that we worked on in recent years was in Miami, Florida, where sea level rise is becoming an issue. You might say, well, how is that a public health issue? Well, they have these things called king tides there, where these are the highest tides of the year. And at high tide, it can be pretty alarming where 9 a.m. in the morning, you're standing in a neighborhood, and by 11 that morning at high tide, you're standing in knee-deep water in the middle of the street. So there was a local university there, Florida International University, had set up a data collection protocol, but hadn't really figured out how to get all this collected in a GIS format. And so we went down there and basically took the data collection protocol and set that up in QGIS so we could use one of these apps. I honestly don't remember which one we ended up using in the field. This allowed us to train people working on the front lines with this to go out and collect this data. And what they were collecting was the depth of the flood water. They were taking a water sample so that they could test for bacterial contamination like fecal coliform, and also the salinity of the water. And we showed people how to collect data on this, and then afterwards make maps that showed for a particular community how much fecal coliform is in that floodwater that their kids are walking through on the way to get the school bus in the morning, for example, how much salinity is in that water that's flooding their front lawn and things like that, and really creating pretty intense issues. And it was very successful down there, and they still have those programs running 2 years after we were down there training them.
So that sounds like a really, really big data collection campaign. So I'm assuming there were multiple individuals out there collecting this kind of data and synchronizing back to a single database, a centralized database. Were there any issues around so many users like updating data on a regular basis?
No, we had basically a data manager who was at the time in charge of merging all of that together and managing it. So there was one person at the university who was kind of the front person for managing that. At the time, there wasn't the merge-in functionality to clone and share a project database. So kind of had to do it more longhand at the time, but it would be much easier today.
So we could assume now that Mergin would take care of that side of it for us if we were doing the same exercise today.
Yeah, you would still want someone, I think, to be the data manager, to be in charge of that process and make sure that the incoming data was accurate and see who had collected what when and make sure it all gets merged successfully. But it would be significantly easier at this point.
I've just got a couple of questions about data, and I realize we're sort of going back in the conversation now, but it just occurred to me that one of the things I've seen people be really interested in doing when they're doing data collection projects is taking pictures of things. Like, this is exactly what it looked like. An image is worth 1,000 words. They would really like to be able to take a picture of it and write a comment about it, or add that as an attribute into the table. Is this something that's possible through these data collection apps?
Yeah, absolutely. They both allow you to take a photograph. So you basically set up a column in your GIS layer ahead of time for the photograph. And in that widget setting, you set that up as an attachment. And then when you get out in the field, you can take a photo, and it basically will have a path to the photo and you can upload all that and use it. You can also choose to pick a photo from your gallery. So you may want to take a photo of something with another app on your phone, and maybe, like you said, mark it up, put some text on there, or circle something of interest, and then upload that as the photo. So that's also possible.
These sound like amazingly flexible apps and a system in general. So I'm really excited about this. I can see so many potential amazing geospatial field projects going ahead because because people now have access to these kinds of solutions.
Yeah, I actually should add real quick that as we were collecting data in Miami, that was a big part of the data collection effort, because we were using photos both to kind of get a scene for what the flood event looked like where the data collection was happening, but we also used it as a backup for some of the data. So we were using, I'm honestly sitting here now forgetting what these were called, but we had these little devices for measuring salinity, and it was possible to take a picture of the result so that you could have a backup in case something went awry with the data entry. So we had a backup photo of the salinity meter, and we also took a picture of the water sample. So we had 3 pictures for every point that we were collecting information on.
So this brings me to another question about data. So if I go to the QField website, for example, it says GPS centric, which makes perfect sense, right? Your phone has a GPS built into it, and that's probably the way we're getting our location. I realize there's other ways for phones to locate themselves, but let's just assume it's running solely off a GPS. That's where our source of location is coming from. Now, we know that with phones, sometimes it's not the most accurate positioning we get. Do we have the option here to attach other perennials, other instruments to the phone? Will they be understood by these apps?
Yeah, I think with these and any other data collection app, you always have the option of using a third-party Bluetooth GPS receiver. And there's quite a few of those on the market that you can find on Amazon and elsewhere. And some of them aren't even, there's a lot of them are fairly affordable and are things that you can strap onto your wrist or your pack or something like that. And I think the advantage for most of those is that they will definitely increase your horizontal and vertical accuracy, but they also often offer better signal lock. So if you're in a park with tree cover and you don't have a clear view of the sky, some of those will lock onto the satellites a little better than your phone would. And so you can definitely get better results. It's a good point, because whenever you're out collecting data, accuracy should be a concern, something you need to think about. And phones use this hybrid locational technology where it will locate you by triangulating off of cell phone towers. If you're in a Wi-Fi network, it can locate you that way. That's slightly more precise. And then it has the GPS, the assisted GPS chip, and that's the most precise. And so if all 3 are accessible at the same time, the phone uses all 3 technologies in some kind of algorithm to try to pinpoint your location. So there's a lot of technology packed into these little mobile devices these days that we sometimes take for granted. And you need to know, I see surprisingly few studies on the accuracy of cell phones. And every year we have updated phones and it changes. So it's constantly improving. And I think, these days it's safe to say that most of them are getting you, within several meters of your true location, but it's sometimes difficult to know exactly how accurate your phone is. And so you can always use a third party Bluetooth GPS to improve that.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good solution, and am completely with you there. Like phones are pretty amazing. When we start to talk about the kind of technology that's being packed into them, it's really impressive. I'm hoping that some stage we'll get to the stage or come to that sort of recognition that calling a phone is kind of like calling a Ferrari a cup holder, because yeah, we make calls with it, but I mean it can do so much else.
Yeah, in fact, I think being a phone is what they're worst at, honestly. They do many things better than actually function as a phone. And in terms of GPS, a lot of the modern phones not only have you can use the GPS constellation, they can also use the GLONASS constellation, and we'll use both of those, I think, collectively to improve locations. So the GPS chips are getting better and better each version.
So I just want to try and summarize now for the listeners just quickly, because I think you've given us a lot of information here. At the start, we talked about these different apps that we could use. You've covered how we set up a QGIS project and get it ready to export into these apps. We talked about the different kinds of methods and systems you might want to use to synchronize data over to the app from the project and back again. And we've talked a little bit about the functionality that are in the apps and the way we set up data ready to be collected and that kind of thing, and think about our data models. So you've given us a ton of value already. I just want to touch on what this app can do. Can it do anything in terms of analysis? Is there any sort of snapping capability? Is there anything sort of built into it that's making sure that we're adhering to the rules of data collection, that we're collecting valid geometries, for example?
Let's see. That's a good question. I think that's one place where at the current time, QField is a little different than Input. QField does have, for example, a split tool that lets you cut a polygon that you've created in half or carve it up in some way. It also has a measure tool. It has some compass integration. So I know people, if you've used something like Google Maps on your phone, you'll see a little kind of what am I going to call it? Like a cone of visibility, like what it'll show you which direction you're facing. And so QField also has that kind of compass integration where it'll show you which direction you're facing as you're moving around. I do not believe that there's any snapping, but I think as soon as I say that, someone from Lutra or OpenGIS is going to say, "Oh no, it does that." If it doesn't do it, I imagine they're working on it, because both of these companies are improving both apps continually. But I don't believe there's any of that kind of geometry snapping capability in either of them. Of course, you could always fix it after the fact fairly simply. And I know that with, for example, if you're collecting points, fairly certain you can move the crosshairs on both of these so that, let's say you want to map something that's behind a fence, or you're mapping a bird nest and you don't want to disturb the nest, but you want to map it and you're in the street next to the tree where the bird nest is. You can choose to take the point, anywhere on the map that you're looking at. So it is possible to kind of offset a point or something like that to put it at a desired location that you can't get to, for example.
That sounds like a much better solution than standing on the bird nest, waiting for the GPS to recognize your location and then collecting the point. I'm pleased someone's thought that far ahead. That's really good. Hey, I've just got a couple more questions about this, but before I let you go, and one of them is, what's the most exciting thing about this for you personally when you think about how far we've come? Because this has been a problem for a long time in the geospatial world when we talk about data collection, as that kind of online offline thing. And I know that we're moving towards a world where we're more connected than we've ever been. So meaning that we're going to be online way more than we've ever been. Is this still an exciting thing for you, seeing these apps, seeing this technology, or are you sort of sitting back going, "Oh, that's nice, but it's going to be redundant in a few years"?
No, I think it's incredibly exciting because I'm an open source advocate, and it's only been within recent years that these kind of apps have come onto the scene and been usable, and so it's really exciting now that you have not only QGIS with everything it is, but you can also use these in concert with QGIS to go out and collect data, and that they perform as well as any proprietary data collection app I've ever seen. To me, it's part of that democratization of technology where these are available to anyone who wants to use them. And for our community health maps project, what this does is it makes solutions that are scalable for a crowd data collection effort, where we can. At one point, we actually had residents of the community who weren't even public health workers who saw us out there and wanted to get involved, and we had a workshop one evening in Miami where we invited people from the neighborhood to get trained in this data collection protocol, and they just installed the app and went out and collected data, kind of being supervised by some of us who were experts. It was so empowering to see these people out there collecting data to something that was personally affecting them. And that kind of scalability is only really possible when you have something that is free and open source.
And easy to learn. And I think I mean, of course, it sounds like it's a simple kind of operation, standing out there collecting data. But if we're going to collect meaningful data, and if it's something that we're going to be able to use later on and make decisions based off that, we also need to do it as accurately as possible. So I think it's amazing that these technologies are so scalable and are so accessible for people. But I think it's also important to remember that probably that was only possible because there were experts like you helping these people out and sort of showing them the way.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Because what I just said belies the fact that months of work had gone into setting up the protocol and the tests and the training materials and all the rest. So obviously that was a unique situation, but it was still a really interesting proof of concept.
Absolutely, and I wasn't trying to be critical at all. I was just trying to point out the fact that I think that we still need to. There still needs to be a certain amount of guidance. I think with these kinds of projects, but the fact that it was possible, that it is accessible to people, is absolutely amazing. So, one last question before I let you go. So, when you think about the technology that's at play here, is there anything that you think that's missing? What is this app screaming out for? What would be the next feature that you would add to it if you could just wave your magic wand and do so?
Well, I think both of these apps could probably will be working on more kind of collaborative editing, where that kind of building having teams, for example, where you have just better synchronization and better control over a group of people all working off of the same QGIS project, for example. I think that kind of functionality is fairly new for merge and input, and it's going to improve and probably show up in QField in the near future. So I think that is a real need people have, because usually collecting data for an organization is going to, you're going to have multiple data collectors out there. So that is kind of crucial. And I know that Lutra is also working on metadata support within Input. So I think, being able to have some kind of metadata access in these is going to be important for the resulting data. So, but I think they're becoming fairly mature. And I think the thing that I appreciate the most is that both companies are being really responsive to reported bugs and things like that, and new versions are coming out quickly. The way they're set up is really ideal. The fact that they're plugins and apps, because they're not tied to QGIS versions in that way. So the plugin can be updated and come out as often as it needs to, irrespective of what version of QGIS you happen to be running. So I think that kind of separation and having it as a plugin is a really great example of why plugins are useful.
Kurt, I really want to thank you for taking the time to teach us all a little bit more about data collection. There's different kinds of open source apps that we might want to consider for our next data collection project, and just teaching us all a little bit more about the QGIS project in general. So thank you so much for your time. Before I let you go, where can the listeners go if they want to reach out to you and learn more?
My website is birdseyeviewgis.com, and people can also visit communityhealthmaps.org. There are some blog posts, for example, one on Input and one on QField up there, and there's also one describing that Miami project. And I can be found on Twitter at Geomenke.
Thanks again, Kurt. I'll be sure to link all those in the show notes for people.
Thanks.
Well, I really hope you enjoyed that interview with Kurt. Like I said before the interview started, Kurt shares a lot of great resources with us and a lot of great links. I'm happy to pass those on to you. If you go along to mapscaping.com/podcast, there's a couple of different email newsletter options there. Choose whichever one fits you, and I will personally send you an email with all the different links and resources that Kurt mentions in the interview. And that's it for another episode of the Mapscaping Podcast. My name is Daniel. As always, it's been an absolute pleasure being your host again this week. For those of you that are enjoying this podcast, if you have a friend or know someone who you think might benefit from hearing this, please share it with them. I would really appreciate it. And as always, you are more than welcome to reach out to me on social media. You can find us at Mapscaping on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You're also more than welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm easy to find. Just search for host of Mapscaping Podcast. There's only one. That's me. I would love to hear from you. Okay, see you next week. Bye.